The rain had begun to fall softly, its gentle taps on the forest floor creating a soothing rhythm. The night was unusually still. A thick fog had rolled in, enveloping the trees in a shroud of mystery. Paul Bunyan sat beneath an old oak, his massive form almost blending with the shadows. His weathered hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching in time with the steady drip of water from the leaves above. Babe, his loyal blue ox, stood nearby, her broad back glistening in the mist, her breath rising in slow clouds in the cool air. The scent of wet earth and pine filled the space around them. There was something in the stillness that made the hairs on the back of Paul's neck stand up. The rain was no longer a lullaby. It had become a whisper that grew louder, more insistent. Paul could feel it. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, but all he could see was the fog, thick and unbroken, swallowing the world around him. Babe snorted. Her hooves shifted, scraping the ground uneasily. Paul looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw something he had never noticed before. Fear. A low rumble echoed through the trees, deep and distant, but growing closer. The air felt different now, heavier. Paul's heart skipped. A sudden gust of wind swept through the forest, rustling the leaves above and sending a shiver down his spine. Babe's tail flicked, her muscles tensing. Something was wrong. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Even the rain had quieted, as if waiting for something. And then there it was, a sound unlike anything Paul had heard before. A low, bone-chilling growl. It was close. Too close. Babe's ears shot up, her eyes wide in terror. Paul's pulse quickened. His hand instinctively reached for his axe, but the air had grown thick, and his movements felt sluggish. Something was coming. Something that shouldn't be here. Something that wasn't part of the world Paul knew. The growl came again, louder this time, vibrating the very ground beneath their feet. And then, as if summoned by the sound, a shadow broke through the mist. A shape, massive, dark. Paul's breath caught in his throat. It was moving toward them, slowly, relentlessly. The ground trembled beneath its weight. The rain, once gentle, now came in sheets, drenching them both. But it wasn't the rain that made Paul's blood run cold. It was the sound of claws scraping against rock, the unmistakable scent of something wild and far too hungry. Babe let out a low, terrified moan. Paul could feel her fear. He shared it. But this, whatever it was too close now. Too close to escape. He couldn't run. Not now. The creature emerged from the fog, its glowing eyes locking onto Paul and Babe with a terrifying intensity. There was no doubt now. It wasn't just any wild creature. It was something ancient, something that had no business in these woods. The shadow loomed larger, and Paul knew there was no way out. The creature's form solidified in the mist, towering over the trees like a nightmare come to life. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, piercing the fog and fixing on Paul. The forest seemed to pulse with its presence, the air thick with an unnatural heat. Paul's hand gripped the handle of his axe, but his fingers felt stiff, unwilling to move. The ground beneath him seemed to hum, vibrating with every step the creature took. Babe took a slow step back, her hooves skidding slightly in the wet mud, but she couldn't pull away fast enough. Paul could feel her fear, and it mirrored his own, a deep, primal fear that he couldn't shake. His heart raced as the creature moved closer, its heavy breath filling the air with the scent of decay. With every movement, the creature seemed to loom larger, like a shadow swallowing the night. Paul's throat went dry, and the world around him felt far too quiet, like the calm before the storm. The beast stopped. A long pause hung in the air, like everything had frozen in place. The rain, still falling in sheets, seemed to fade away, as if the world was holding its breath. The only sound was the frantic beating of Paul's heart. And then the growl came again. This time, it was close enough to shake the very ground beneath them. Paul could feel the vibrations in his chest, a deep, rumbling growl that sent chills through his entire body. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. No words would come. The creature took another step forward, its massive claws scraping the ground, sending sparks of light into the wet darkness. Babe's ears flattened, and she took another hesitant step back, her eyes wide with terror. Paul's mind raced. He had fought giants, battled storms, and faced countless dangers in his time. But this was different. The air was too thick. The creature was too powerful. He could see the creature's mouth now, twisted in a grotesque snarl, its teeth sharp as daggers. The ground beneath Paul's feet shifted, and suddenly, the rain felt colder, far colder. A deep sense of dread washed over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't just after him. It was after something else. A faint whisper reached his ears, a voice that wasn't his own. "Run, Paul, run." It was barely audible, yet unmistakable. But Paul couldn't move. His body felt heavy, like it was being held in place by some unseen force. The creature stepped closer, and then, in an instant, it lunged. Faster than Paul could react, the creature was upon them. The ground cracked beneath its feet as it reached for Babe, its claws swiping through the air with terrifying precision. Paul's heart stopped. In the chaos, the world around him seemed to blur. The air grew thick with the smell of earth and blood. The sound of Babe's hooves pounding against the ground echoed in his ears. And the growl, that deep, guttural growl, filled his mind with terror. It was all happening too quickly. The creature's claws found their mark. Babe let out a pained bellow, and Paul's world spun out of control. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but his body remained frozen. The forest, the rain, the shadows, everything seemed to close in. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. A sudden, eerie silence filled the air. Paul blinked, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. But when his eyes cleared, he saw it. Babe was still standing, trembling, but unharmed. The creature was gone. For a moment, Paul stood frozen, unable to comprehend the turn of events. His hands still gripped his axe, his heart still racing, but the beast was no longer there. He looked around the fog-filled forest, his breath shallow. What had just happened? What had he seen? And what did it mean for them both? The rain continued to fall, but it didn't seem as soothing anymore. Something had changed. The quiet was unsettling now. Paul slowly, cautiously, made his way to Babe. She was still trembling, but she nuzzled him gently, her warm breath comforting against the cold. As he ran a hand along her back, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something darker had just passed through the forest. And no matter how many storms they had weathered before, this one felt different. He turned to face the path ahead, his heart heavy with questions. But for now, he knew they had to keep moving. Something was coming. And Paul Bunyan would be ready. Paul's grip on his axe tightened. The forest around them, once a comforting haven, now felt foreign, hostile. The fog lingered in the air like a thick, suffocating blanket, clinging to the trees and the ground. Babe shifted uneasily beside him, her hooves scraping the wet earth as if sensing the same unease. The gentle rain that had once seemed like a lullaby now sounded like a warning, the steady drip from the branches above echoing ominously in the silence. "Stay close, girl," Paul murmured to Babe, his voice low, barely above a whisper. He took a cautious step forward, eyes scanning the mist for any sign of movement. The air felt electric, charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the creature, he realized, it was something more. A presence. A force that had settled over the forest like a dark cloud. Every sound now felt amplified. Every movement felt exaggerated, like they were being watched by unseen eyes. A distant crack of a branch broke the stillness, sharp and sudden. Paul's head snapped toward the sound, his heart hammering in his chest. His senses were heightened, his body coiled like a spring, ready to act, but there was nothing in the fog. Nothing, except for the trees. And the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the mist. Not the creature from before, but something just as unsettling. A tall, shadowy figure with long, ragged hair. It seemed to float rather than walk, its body shrouded in tattered robes that seemed to blend with the darkness around it. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Paul could feel its gaze burning through the mist, locking onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Babe snorted in alarm, taking a step back. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move either. It simply stood there, as if waiting for something. Paul's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary traveler lost in the fog. The air around the figure seemed colder, and the very earth beneath it seemed to bend, twisting unnaturally in the rain. "Who are you?" Paul called, his voice strong but shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand, a long, bony finger pointing directly at him. A chill ran down Paul's spine, creeping deep into his bones. And then, without warning, the figure vanished. Gone. The mist swallowed it whole, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, Paul just stood there, heart pounding, barely able to move. His breath was shallow, as if the world around him had shifted, and he was caught in the space between dreams and reality. What in the name of the stars was that? Babe's nervous snort pulled him back to the present. He glanced at her, and for a brief moment, he saw the same unease reflected in her eyes. "Come on, girl," he muttered, trying to shake off the unease that clung to him like the fog itself. They needed to keep moving. They needed to leave the forest before whatever this was swallowed them whole. But as they began to walk, the mist thickened, the trees closing in tighter around them. The path, once clear, was now nearly impossible to see. The rain, which had been steady, began to intensify again, pouring down in sheets. Each drop seemed to splatter against the ground with unnatural force, as if the very sky itself was in turmoil. And that was when Paul heard it again. A growl. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind them. His heart raced. Turning quickly, he tried to pierce the fog, but the mist was too thick, the shadows too deep. The growl came again, low and rumbling, vibrating the very ground beneath his feet. And then the figure from before reappeared. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, emerging from the mist like ghosts, were more figures, tall, hooded, and impossibly still. There were dozens of them now, surrounding Paul and Babe, their faces hidden, their movements slow and deliberate. The growl echoed again, closer now, accompanied by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and nearing. Something was closing in. Something he couldn't see, but he could feel it, creeping in from all directions. The figures in the mist shifted, their eyes glowing now, reflecting the light of the storm. They were not human, not by any means. Their forms shimmered in the rain, distorting, twisting like shadows made flesh. And the growl came again, louder, vibrating in the air with a force that rattled his bones. Paul's instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew there was nowhere to run. The fog was too thick. The figures were too many. The creature was coming. The one he had felt before, the one that had haunted them in the silence of the woods. But this time, it wasn't alone. This time, the hunt was on. The air was suffocating, thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth and an ancient, pungent odor that Paul couldn't place. His every instinct screamed at him to move, to fight, but his legs felt heavy, his body stiff. The growl, low and terrifying, vibrated through the very ground, shaking his bones as it echoed from every direction. The figures, now fully surrounding him and Babe, were moving closer, their long, skeletal hands reaching out with deliberate slowness. Their faces remained hidden beneath hoods, but the faintest glimmers of pale, glowing eyes flickered beneath the shadows, cold and unblinking. The growl was louder now, close, too close. The fog seemed to swallow up any light, and the trees around them groaned under the pressure of some unseen force. Paul's grip tightened around his axe, but it felt too small, too insignificant against the strange, almost suffocating power that filled the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being trapped, slowly but surely. Like prey, cornered in the dark. Babe stood at his side, her muscles tensed, eyes darting from figure to figure. She wasn't just afraid, she was terrified. Her every instinct, like his, told her to flee, but the path was blocked, the shadows closing in. A chilling laugh echoed through the trees, a sound so unnatural that it sent a cold wave through Paul's chest. It wasn't the growl. It was something else, something mocking, something ancient. And then, from the depths of the mist, the creature emerged. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer a vague shape. The massive form stepped forward, its hulking frame towering over the figures surrounding them. Its eyes burned like molten amber, its massive jaws dripped with dark saliva, sharp teeth gleaming in the faint light. Paul's breath caught in his throat. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its power undeniable. It wasn't just a beast, it was something older, something more terrifying. Something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the rain, the fog, the silence to fall into place. The growl was deafening now, echoing from the beast's throat, shaking the very air around them. The figures in the mist shifted, their hands trembling as they slowly raised their arms, forming a circle around Paul and Babe. The world had become an endless tunnel of darkness and tension, where the only thing that existed was the creature, its glowing eyes, and the oppressive stillness. The creature took another step forward, the earth trembling beneath its weight, and for the first time, Paul felt a flicker of real fear. Not just for himself, but for Babe. She was his constant companion, his protector, but right now, she seemed small, fragile in the face of this overwhelming presence. The creature's jaw opened wide, its teeth bared in a silent snarl. Paul knew it could end them both in an instant if it chose to. He tried to move, but the air was thick, heavy with some strange energy that kept him rooted to the spot. The figures were closing in, their eyes now gleaming with hunger. Something was building in the air, an energy that Paul couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just the creature. The mist, the shadows, the figures, it was all part of something far larger. Something ancient. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, snapping branches and tearing at the fog. For a moment, the shadows flickered, and Paul saw it. A glimpse of someone, standing just beyond the creature. It was the figure. The one in tattered robes, the one who had disappeared into the mist earlier. But now it wasn't floating. Now it was standing firm, its bony fingers raised high, as if summoning something. Something from beyond the mist. The ground trembled again, harder this time, as if the earth itself was trying to escape whatever force was drawing them in. A deafening roar split the silence, so loud it almost seemed to tear the very air apart. The creature lunged. The world seemed to slow, the fog thickening like a wall as Paul swung his axe. But the creature was too fast, its jaws snapping toward Babe with terrifying speed. And then, as if summoned by the roar, the air split open with a burst of light. A shadow surged forward, bigger than anything Paul had ever seen. It moved between him and Babe, its form like a wall of darkness, blocking the creature's strike in a single motion. The creature howled in frustration, its massive claws scraping the ground as it recoiled, momentarily stunned by the force of the unknown presence that had intervened. The figures in the mist froze, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to understand what was happening. Something ancient, something far beyond his understanding, had just entered the fray. The beast recoiled, its eyes flashing with rage as it took a step back. The figures around them seemed to shift, their bodies twitching as though something had changed. A voice, not his own, echoed in his mind, calm and powerful, resonating with the weight of ages. "Not yet, Paul Bunyan." The voice was a warning, a promise. And in that moment, Paul realized this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The creature snarled, its gaze flickering toward the dark figure that had intervened. The mist seemed to shudder, and the temperature dropped, the tension building as the battle between these ancient forces escalated. The rain had stopped. The fog swirled around them like a living thing. And Paul knew, with a certainty he couldn't ignore, that the true test had only just begun. The world around Paul felt as if it had fractured into two opposing forces, the air thick with tension, each moment dragging longer than the last. The creature stood still, its immense form shimmering with raw, untamed fury, its molten amber eyes fixed on the dark figure before it. The ancient power that had intervened was still cloaked in shadow, its form barely visible through the swirling fog, but its presence was undeniable, immense, towering, and overwhelming. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself was caught in the balance between life and death. The figures in the mist, once moving in slow, deliberate steps, had now stilled completely, their ghostly forms frozen, their eyes watching intently. Paul's heart thundered in his chest as he gripped his axe tightly, but it felt useless against the magnitude of what stood before him. The creature, snarling and growling, seemed to sense the change in the air, its primal instincts vibrating through the forest like a pulse. It stepped forward once more, its claws scraping against the wet earth with an eerie screech. But the dark figure did not flinch. With an almost unnatural calm, the figure raised its hand, palm open, as if summoning the very essence of the forest itself. The wind stirred again, but this time it was colder, sharper, like a blade slicing through the thick fog. The trees groaned as if they were bending to an ancient will, their roots stretching deep into the earth, as if rising to aid the figure. And then the creature lunged. But this time, it was met with something far more powerful than it had expected. The dark figure did not move, but a wave of force emanated from it, sending a shock wave through the fog, and suddenly, the ground beneath Paul and Babe's feet cracked open. The earth split with a deafening roar, and the very trees around them groaned, their trunks bending as if the forest itself was alive and responding to the battle. The creature howled in rage, its monstrous form lashing out, claws slicing through the air, but it was met with an invisible barrier, something solid yet intangible that repelled its every strike. Paul could see the creature's fury, the raw, untamed power radiating from it, but it was struggling against something it had not anticipated, a force far older, far more mysterious than anything Paul had ever encountered. The dark figure stepped forward, its form finally becoming clearer, the robes now billowing like smoke, its face still obscured by a hood. But there was a coldness in its presence that sent a chill down Paul's spine. This figure was not merely an observer, it was a force of nature itself, standing as a guardian between them and the terrible creature. The creature roared again, louder this time, its eyes narrowing as it locked onto the figure, its primal rage building. But then, unexpectedly, the creature paused. A low rumbling sound echoed from deep within its chest, and for the first time, the beast seemed to hesitate. The dark figure raised its hand once more, and the creature, for reasons unknown, stopped. Its eyes shifted, flicking back and forth between the figure and Paul, as if it was being held by some invisible force. Paul's breath was shallow, his entire body trembling with the intensity of the moment. He could feel the weight of something ancient, something far beyond his understanding, pressing down on him. He could feel the forest, the earth beneath him, even the air itself, pulling into alignment. This was no ordinary fight. This was a battle that stretched across time, that reached into the very fabric of the world. The dark figure's voice, low and distant, sounded in Paul's mind again. Not yet, Paul Bunyan. There is still much to do. Paul swallowed hard, his grip on his axe tightening. The warning was clear, but what did it mean? What could he possibly do against something like this? The dark figure took another step forward, its presence overwhelming the entire forest. A low hum filled the air, vibrating the very trees, sending ripples through the fog. The creature, despite its size and power, seemed to shrink back, as though it had finally realized the nature of the force standing before it. The ground beneath them trembled, as if the battle was reaching its crescendo, and the trees groaned in the winds. The figures in the mist began to move again, but this time they were not in control. They were not the ones driving the events of the night. They were simply puppets, controlled by an unseen hand. The growls and whispers of the ancient figures grew fainter, swallowed by the power of the dark figure. The creature, now caught between two immense forces, let out a final, ear-piercing scream, its eyes flicking wildly between the figure and Paul. It didn't understand. It was too primal, too feral to comprehend the scope of what was happening. And then, in an instant, the creature was gone. One moment it was there, a towering, monstrous form of terror and rage. The next, it was consumed by the fog, swallowed up by the very earth itself. The ground trembled one last time, and all was still. The dark figure stood motionless, its form fading into the mist as if it were never truly there. Paul stood in stunned silence, his heart racing, unsure whether what had just happened was real. His grip on his axe loosened, and he turned to Babe. The massive blue ox stood beside him, trembling but safe. For now, the danger had passed. But as Paul looked around the forest, the fog slowly dissipating, He couldn't shake the feeling that the night had only revealed a fragment of something far larger. Something that wasn't finished yet. The wind whispered through the trees, a soft, eerie sound, like a voice lost to time. And deep in his bones, Paul could feel it, a promise that the balance of the world had been disturbed, and the forces of nature had not finished their course. For now, Paul and Babe were safe, but the story was far from over. The night had revealed the first of many trials to come. And Paul, the giant lumberjack, knew one thing for sure: there would be more to face, more to understand, before the true mystery of the forest was revealed. And whatever lay ahead, he and Babe would be ready. The mist was thinning, but the eerie silence lingered in the air. Paul and Babe stood motionless, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on them like a heavy fog that refused to lift. The forest, once so familiar, now felt alien, as though the events of the night had reshaped it in ways Paul couldn't fully comprehend. Paul took a slow, deliberate breath, his chest heavy with the uncertainty of what came next. The rain had stopped, leaving the world drenched in a quiet stillness. He could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the trees, the occasional snap of a branch as the forest began to settle. But there was something beneath it all, a hum in the air, a faint vibration that tickled the back of his mind. Babe, ever the vigilant companion, flicked her ears back, her large eyes scanning the fog that still clung to the trees. She snorted softly, as though trying to make sense of what had just occurred, but like Paul, she felt the strange weight of the moment. It was as if something had shifted in the very bones of the earth, and neither of them knew if it was for better or worse. "Guess we're not in the clear yet, huh, girl?" Paul murmured to Babe, his voice almost lost in the stillness. The ox let out a soft snort, as if agreeing with him. She was tense, her muscles coiled beneath her thick fur, her eyes still darting to the spaces between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Paul wiped the sweat from his brow, the cool mist now mixing with the dampness of the night. The air was unnervingly still, no wind, no chirping of insects, nothing to break the silence. He felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then it happened. A faint, distant sound, like the creaking of a branch, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But not just any footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate, almost purposeful. Paul's hand instinctively gripped the axe at his side, his heart leaping in his chest. His eyes snapped to the path ahead, but the fog was too thick to see clearly. The sound grew louder, closer. Suddenly, a shape emerged from the mist. Not the creature from before, but something else, something just as unsettling. A figure, tall, cloaked in shadows, with a presence that made the ground beneath Paul's feet tremble slightly. The air felt colder, more oppressive, as if the weight of the world itself had shifted to focus on this new arrival. The figure stopped a few yards away, just within the haze, its form almost indistinguishable from the fog. The tension in the air was palpable, as if this moment, the stillness before whatever was to come, held the very essence of fate itself. Paul's grip tightened on his axe. This was different. Whatever force had intervened before, The one that had driven the creature back, it wasn't here now. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man standing at the edge of a great abyss. And then, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried on the wind like a prophecy. "You've done well, Paul Bunyan. But this is not the end. Only a pause in the storm." The words hung in the air, vibrating through the fog like a silent echo. Paul's heart skipped a beat. The voice was not one he recognized, but there was something in it, something ancient, familiar, and terrifying all at once. It was like hearing a distant memory from a past he had long since forgotten. "Who are you?" Paul asked, his voice steady, though he felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you want with me?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. There was a long pause before it answered, its voice carrying the weight of ages. "I am a keeper of balance, a guardian of things unseen, unspoken. The forces you've encountered tonight are but a fragment of what is to come. The earth, the forest, the world itself, they are shifting." Paul felt a coldness creep into his bones at the figure's words. He glanced at Babe, whose head was lowered, her ears flat against her skull. She was as uneasy as he was. Whatever this figure was, it was not someone they should trust lightly. "What does that mean?" Paul pressed, his grip on the axe tightening even further. "What's coming?" The figure stepped forward slightly, its silhouette merging with the mist. As it did, the very air around it seemed to distort, as though reality itself was bending. "You will soon learn," it said, the words hanging in the fog like a dark promise. "The creatures you've faced, the shadows in the trees, they are but a harbinger. The balance is breaking. And when it does, all that you've known will be undone. You, Paul Bunyan, are a key to this change. But what you do with it and how you face it will determine the fate of everything." The figure seemed to grow even more distant as it spoke, its form dissolving into the fog. "Remember," it whispered, just before vanishing completely, "the storm is not always loud, but it always comes." And just like that, the figure was gone. The forest felt darker now, the stillness stretching into an uncomfortable quiet that was almost suffocating. The trees stood tall, their branches thick and gnarled, but they too seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to happen. Paul's heart still raced, but now there was a new kind of fear settling in. The force that had intervened before had seemed to protect them, but this new presence, it was different. It wasn't a protector. It was a harbinger of something much more dangerous, something far beyond his understanding. For the first time in his life, Paul Bunyan felt truly small. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, like the weight of an approaching storm. The trees, once familiar companions in Paul's long years of wandering the forest, now loomed over him like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, as if recoiling from something unseen. The mist continued to swirl, thick and oppressive, clinging to everything, obscuring even the path beneath his feet. It was as though the very air was saturated with a force Paul couldn't name. Babe shifted uneasily beside him, her massive frame twitching, muscles tense beneath her coat. She snorted, a low rumble that seemed almost like a question, but Paul had no answer for her. He barely had an answer for himself. What was that? Paul muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice sounded foreign in the stillness, like it didn't belong in this world anymore. He turned his eyes to the path ahead, but there was nothing. The dark figure, the one who had spoken, had disappeared into the mist as if it had never been there at all. It had left behind nothing but its words, an echo that clung to the air like a memory. But what did it all mean? The storm, the balance, the creatures? Paul had never been one to give much thought to forces beyond his understanding, but there was something undeniable in the figure's warning, a presence, a power, that had pierced through the veil of his own certainty. Paul clenched his jaw, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He had fought battles before, faced down beasts, and survived countless dangers. But this was different. The forest had always been his domain, his place of strength. And yet now it felt alien, hostile even. A soft rustling came from the trees above, followed by the faintest snap of a twig underfoot. Paul froze, his hand instinctively going to the axe at his side. He knew that sound. It was the sound of something moving in the fog, something trying to stay hidden, trying to stay silent. He could feel the tension in the air building once more, like a storm on the horizon, ready to break. "Stay close, babe," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the forest. The ox moved in closer, her great bulk pressing against his side as they both stood in the unnerving stillness. The rustling grew louder, closer now. Something was out there, something just beyond the reach of the fog. And then it emerged. A shape, tall and looming, stepping out of the mist like a shadow come to life. Paul's breath caught in his throat. It was unlike any creature he had encountered before. Its form was tall, wiry, almost skeletal, yet there was a grace in its movement that sent a chill down his spine. It seemed to glide through the fog, its eyes glowing faintly, its skin pale and thin as if stretched too tightly over bones. The figure was wearing a cloak of dark, tattered cloth, its edges frayed and torn, moving as if it had no weight, no substance. Paul instinctively stepped forward, his heart racing, his hand tight on the handle of his axe. But as he did, he noticed something that froze him in place. The creature, whatever it was not alone. Behind it, more figures emerged, silent and spectral, their forms almost invisible in the mist, their eyes flickering in the darkness like distant stars. Paul's mind raced. He had fought many things in his life, but never had he faced anything like this. These creatures, these shadows, what were they? Where had they come from? Were they a part of the forest? Or had they been summoned by the same unseen forces that had stirred the storm? The lead figure, tall and gaunt, stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking onto Paul's with unnerving intensity. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint drip of water from the leaves above. Then, in a voice that was more felt than heard, the figure spoke. "You are the one. The giant of the woods." Paul's heart skipped a beat. The figure knew him. But how? "I know who you are, Paul Bunyan," the figure continued, its voice low and hollow, like the wind through dead trees. You are more than what you seem, more than the lumberjack, more than the man. You are the key, the last of the old world. Paul's mind raced, his body tense with the urge to strike. But something in the creature's tone kept him still, kept him listening. There was power here, something ancient, something beyond his reckoning. "What do you want with me?" Paul asked, his voice barely steady. The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing, as if considering Paul's question. For a long moment there was no answer. Then the figure spoke again, its words slow and deliberate. "You are the last of your kind, Paul Bunyan. The last of the protectors, the last of the giants. The balance of the world is breaking, and with it, the old forces stir. Forces you cannot control. Forces that will destroy everything." Paul felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. The figure was speaking of something far beyond him, far beyond what he understood. But the mention of destruction, the breaking of the world, sent a wave of panic through him. What could he possibly do against such forces? "You are not ready," the figure said, its voice cold and final. "But time is running out. Soon the storm will come, and you will have to choose." The mist swirled around Paul and Babe, closing in, thickening like a wall. The creature's words echoed in his mind, their weight sinking into his chest. Choose. What did it mean? What could he possibly choose? His mind raced, his thoughts scrambling to find an answer. But before he could ask more, before he could demand more answers, the figure faded back into the mist, disappearing without a trace, as though it had never been there at all. The rustling in the trees died away, leaving behind only the unsettling silence. Paul stood frozen for a long moment, his heart pounding, his mind spinning. The forest seemed different now, darker, more alive with a presence he couldn't understand. The ground beneath his feet felt fragile, as if the very earth was shifting, preparing for something he wasn't ready to face. And then the wind picked up again. A soft whisper, almost inaudible, rustled through the trees. "The storm is coming, Paul Bunyan. Are you ready?" Paul's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't ready, but there was no time to waste. The storm was coming, and he would have to face it, whatever it was, head on. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the weight of unseen forces, and Paul could feel it in his very bones. The world around him had shifted, its once familiar contours now twisted with uncertainty. He glanced at Babe, whose large eyes reflected the same confusion and fear that churned within him. She shifted nervously, her hooves scraping the wet earth, the tension between them palpable. The mist still clung to the ground, swirling in thick, impenetrable tendrils. Every gust of wind seemed to grow sharper, colder, as if the very air had turned against them. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place of danger, alive with a hidden pulse that both beckoned and threatened. "Time's running out," Paul muttered to himself, barely audible over the rising wind. The voice of the figure, that shadowed guardian, echoed in his mind. "You are not ready. But time is running out." Soon the storm will come. He could feel it now, the weight of that storm pressing down on him, suffocating him with its promise of destruction. The very trees seemed to be leaning in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, warning him of something lurking just beyond the veil of the mist. But what was it? What exactly was this storm? And how could he possibly prepare for something that seemed so vast, so inevitable? Paul clenched his fists, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his axe. His mind raced. He had fought battles before, faced down monsters and strange creatures in the heart of the wilderness. But nothing like this. Nothing that felt so much like the earth itself was being torn apart. "Babe," Paul said quietly, looking at his faithful companion. "We've never been in a fight like this before." Babe snorted softly, her breath visible in the cold air, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a shared acknowledgement of the danger they faced. Paul turned his gaze back to the forest, scanning the swirling mist. The figure's words kept repeating in his mind, like a mantra he couldn't escape. "You are the key, the last of the old world." He didn't understand it. The key to what? Was he the last of the protectors the figure had spoken of? What did that even mean? The wind gusted again, the trees groaning under its force. Paul knew he couldn't wait much longer. Whatever was coming, whatever the storm was, it wouldn't wait for him to figure it out. He had to move. He had to act. With a deep breath, he turned and began walking, Babe close behind him, their massive footprints leaving deep impressions in the wet earth. The path ahead was shrouded in mist, the trees towering like silent watchers on either side. But Paul didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. As he walked, the ground began to feel different. There was a shift in the air, something subtle but undeniably present. It was as if the earth itself was whispering to him, urging him forward, guiding him toward something, or perhaps warning him. The deeper they went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees felt closer now, their branches thick with the weight of the mist. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and wet leaves. It was as though the forest was closing in on them, trapping them in a labyrinth of its own design. Paul's pulse quickened. The silence around him was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. Every step he took seemed to echo in the void, and the air hummed with an eerie energy that prickled his skin. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for him. And then, in the distance, a shape began to emerge from the mist. A shadow, tall and unearthly, standing motionless in the fog. At first, Paul thought it was just another trick of the mist, a figment of his imagination. But as he drew closer, it became clearer, a figure, cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing faintly. It was the same creature. The one he had seen before, the one that had spoken in cryptic riddles, the one that had warned him of the storm. This time, though, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures appeared, rising from the mist like ghosts of an ancient time. They were tall, thin, and twisted, their bodies seeming to flicker in and out of existence. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, their forms shifting and undulating as if they were made of smoke, barely holding their shape. They moved silently, their presence filling the space around Paul with an overwhelming sense of dread. The creature at the front stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking onto Paul's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "You've come far," it said. Its voice, like a low whisper, felt more than heard. "But the time has come. The storm is upon you, Paul Bunyan, and you are the only one who can stop it." Paul's heart hammered in his chest. "Stop it?" he repeated, his voice tight with confusion and fear. "How? What storm? What's happening?" The creature's eyes burned brighter, and its form seemed to pulse with an energy that made the air itself vibrate. "The balance is broken," it said, its voice cold and filled with an ancient sorrow. "The forces that once kept the world in check are fading, and soon chaos will reign. The earth itself will split, the skies will tear, and everything will be consumed. Only you, Paul Bunyan, hold the power to restore what has been lost. But the price will be steep." A deep, reverberating rumble echoed through the forest, the sound so low it felt like it was coming from deep within the earth. The ground trembled beneath Paul's feet, and the trees seemed to shudder, their branches swaying with a force that didn't match the wind. The storm had begun. Paul's breath caught in his throat. The sky above, once a dark, oppressive gray, now churned with violent energy. Clouds swirled, twisting into unnatural shapes, their edges crackling with lightning. The wind howled, sending the mist into a frenzied dance. The forest was alive with a primal, untamed force, a force Paul couldn't ignore. "This is your test, Paul Bunyan," the creature continued, its voice echoing in the chaos. "The storm is not just a battle of nature. It is a battle of choice. The question is, will you save this world, or will you let it fall?" Paul's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest as the world around him seemed to shift and warp with the power of the storm. The air was thick with an electric charge, and every gust of wind seemed to carry a deeper, more primal energy that shook the very ground beneath his feet. The trees swayed violently, their branches twisting as though fighting against the tempest's pull, and the mist that had once surrounded them now seemed to form unnatural shapes, shifting and moving like living things. The creature's words echoed in his mind, each syllable carrying the weight of 1,000 lifetimes, each one urging him to act. The storm is not just a battle of nature. It is a battle of choice. Will you save this world, or will you let it fall? Paul's breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the storm itself. He had never imagined he would face such a choice, such a monumental task. He had always believed that his strength, his size, would be enough to overcome any challenge, to defend the forest and its creatures. But this was different. This was something beyond brute strength, beyond the limits of what he had ever known. The wind howled louder, whipping through the trees, and the rumble of thunder grew closer, reverberating through the very earth. The sky, once a dull gray, had turned an unnatural shade of green, swirling like a vortex ready to consume everything in its path. It felt like the world was unraveling at the seams. He looked to Babe, her massive form standing resolutely beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and determination that he felt deep within his soul. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. She was more than just a companion. She was his anchor in this us. The figures, the spectral beings, stood motionless, their glowing eyes never leaving Paul. They seemed unaffected by the chaos that raged around them, as though they were a part of the storm itself. Their presence felt both terrifying and oddly comforting, like the calm before the true fury of the tempest. Paul took a deep breath, his grip tightening around his axe. The choice was his, but what did it mean? What was he truly being asked to do? Could he really restore the balance, heal the broken world, or was he merely a pawn in some greater, incomprehensible game? Tell me, Paul demanded, his voice carrying over the wind. What is the price? What will it cost me? The creature stepped forward, its form flickering and wavering as though it existed in two places at once. Its eyes, those cold, glowing eyes, focused on Paul with an intensity that made him feel small, insignificant. The price is not one you can imagine, giant, it said, its voice heavy with an ancient sorrow. To restore balance, to stop the storm from tearing this world apart, you must make a sacrifice. A sacrifice that will forever change you. You must give up the very thing that defines you. The thing that makes you who you are. Only then will the storm end. Paul's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, grappling with the weight of those words. What could he possibly give up? His strength? His size? The very essence of who he was, the things that had defined him since the day he had first stepped into the forest? Tell me, Paul demanded, his voice carrying over the wind. What is the price? What will it cost me? The creature stepped forward, its form flickering and wavering as though it existed in two places at once. Its eyes, those cold, glowing eyes, focused on Paul with an intensity that made him feel small, insignificant. The price is not one you can imagine, giant, it said, its voice heavy with an ancient sorrow. To restore balance, to stop the storm from tearing this world apart, you must make a sacrifice. A sacrifice that will forever change you. You must give up the very thing that defines you. The thing that makes you who you are. Only then will the storm end. Paul's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, grappling with the weight of those words. What could he possibly give up? His strength? His size? The very essence of who he was, the things that had defined him since the day he had first stepped into the forest? But as he thought about it, something deep within him stirred, a realization that sent a shiver down his spine. The forest was dying, the balance was broken, and the creatures of the mist were not here to help him. They were waiting for him to make a decision, to choose between saving the world and saving himself. The storm was a reflection of everything that had been lost, everything that had gone wrong. It was a test of who Paul Bunyan truly was, and whether he was willing to sacrifice everything to restore what had been taken. The wind howled again, now deafening, and Paul could feel the ground trembling beneath his feet. The storm was closing in. There was no more time to hesitate. He looked back at Babe, her large form standing tall beside him, the only constant in this whirlwind of uncertainty. She was more than just a companion. She was a symbol of everything Paul had fought for, everything he had protected. But this was bigger than them. This was a fight for the world itself. "Tell me what I have to do," Paul said, his voice low but resolute. "I'll do it. I'll make the sacrifice. I'll stop the storm." The creature's eyes flickered with a hint of something approval, perhaps? Or was it pity? It was impossible to tell. But it nodded slowly, as if it had known all along that this moment would come. "The storm will end, Paul Bunyan," it said, its voice softening. "But you must leave behind the world you know. Your strength, your size, your place in this forest. You must become something new, something different. The price of restoring the balance is the very essence of your being." Paul felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the weight of the creature's words settling like a cold stone in his chest. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the very air crackling with the energy of the storm. But the choice was clear now, and the storm was not waiting for him to decide. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking one final breath of the world he had known, the forest, the trees, the creatures that called it home. And then, with a deep exhale, he stepped forward, his eyes locked on the creature's glowing form. "I will do it," Paul said, his voice firm. "Whatever it takes. I will restore the balance." The moment he spoke those words, the ground beneath him trembled once more, and the storm above them erupted in a deafening roar, a brilliant flash of lightning splitting the sky. The wind screamed in fury, and the trees bent under the force of the tempest. But through it all, Paul stood tall, his heart resolute, knowing that whatever came next, he had made his choice. The world seemed to hold its breath as Paul made his decision. The moment he spoke those words, the storm surged forward with a fury that felt like the earth itself was splitting apart. The wind whipped through the trees with an unrelenting force, snapping branches and sending leaves flying in every direction. The sky above twisted, a churning mass of black and green clouds, crackling with violent lightning that danced across the heavens. The storm raged louder now, the wind howling through the trees and the sky growing ever darker. Paul could feel the pressure building, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He had always been the giant, the protector of the forest, the embodiment of strength and endurance. Could he truly give that up? A strange sensation began to stir within him. His very skin prickled, as if the air itself was shifting around him, changing, transforming. His muscles, once hardened from years of labor, seemed to throb with an unfamiliar energy. The mist around him grew denser, swirling and wrapping around his body, filling his lungs with the cold, damp air. It was as if the forest itself was calling to him, urging him to make the sacrifice, to shed the very identity that had defined him for so long. A flash of lightning split the sky, blinding in its intensity, and in that moment, Paul felt a deep, shuddering pull within himself. He could feel the roots of the trees beneath him, the soil, the very bones of the earth shifting in response. His mind was flooded with images of the world he had loved, of the forests, of the creatures he had protected, of the rivers and the winds that had always been his companions. but now it felt different. The world seemed to be asking him to become something more, something beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. Paul Bunyan, the creature said again, its voice soft and distant now, as though it was speaking from a great distance. To restore balance, you must shed your mortal form. You will not be a man, but part of the living world, part of the breath of the earth itself. In return, you will become a guardian once more, not as you were, but as you are meant to be. The storm will end, but you will not walk the earth in the same way. Paul closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. The choice was clear now. To save the world, he would have to leave it behind. He would become one with the forest, the sky, the rivers. He would lose himself in the very essence of the earth, and in doing so, restore the balance that had been broken. The wind howled once more, but this time it felt different. It was no longer the violent roar of a storm. It was a whisper, a call to the soul, a beckoning. Without another word, Paul knelt down, his great hands pressing against the wet earth, feeling the pulse of the world beneath him. His muscles tensed, and his breath came in sharp gasps as he prepared for the unimaginable. The very air around him seemed to shimmer with energy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the final move. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he felt something strange, something pulling at him, stretching him, unraveling the very fibers of his being. It was a sensation unlike any he had ever known, a deep, primal change that shook him to his core. And then, as the storm reached its crescendo, Paul Bunyan made the sacrifice. He surrendered himself to the earth, to the storm, to the very forces of nature that had shaped him. His body shimmered and faded, slowly dissolving into the mist, his massive form shrinking, his once mighty strength fading into the soil. The storm roared once more, a deafening, overwhelming sound. And then, as if in response to Paul's sacrifice, it began to fade. The clouds that had darkened the sky began to disperse, the winds died down, and the mist lifted, leaving the world bathed in a soft, golden light. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the forest was silent. The trees stood tall and strong, the rivers flowed with a renewed vigor, and the creatures of the woods stirred from their hiding places, sensing that something had changed. And though Paul Bunyan was no longer there, in the form that the world had known, his spirit remained. He was part of the world now, part of the breath of the earth, the rhythm of the wind, the pulse of the river. He was the guardian once more, not as a man, but as something greater, something eternal. The balance had been restored. The storm had ended. The world had been saved. But Paul Bunyan, the giant of the forest, had become something more, something timeless. As the storm finally began to recede, the world around the forest grew still. The heavy winds that had once howled through the trees now barely stirred the leaves, and the air, thick with the tension of the storm, began to clear, replaced by a cool calm that felt like a gentle breath after a long, violent struggle. The trees, battered but resolute, stood tall in the aftermath, their leaves glistening with droplets of rain. The rivers, once churning with the fury of the storm, had begun to settle, their waters flowing peacefully once again, as though nothing had ever disturbed their course. But there was something different now. The very essence of the forest seemed to hum with a quiet, invisible power, a power that felt ancient, alive, and connected to everything. It was a subtle presence, but undeniable. It was as if the storm had not only passed, but had revealed something deeper, something that had always been there beneath the surface. The animals, too, seemed to sense the change. The deer stepped cautiously from their hidden places in the underbrush, their eyes wide and alert, yet calm. The birds that had taken refuge in the safety of the trees began to sing again, their melody soft and sweet, as though the world itself had been reborn. In the heart of the forest, where the storm had raged most fiercely, there was now a silence that felt sacred, as though the land itself was resting after a great struggle. The mist, which had cloaked the ground in mystery and fey. The storm raged louder now, the wind howling through the trees and the sky growing ever darker. Paul could feel the pressure building, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He had always been the giant, the protector of the forest, the embodiment of strength and endurance. Could he truly give that up? A strange sensation began to stir within him. His very skin prickled, as if the air itself was shifting around him, changing, transforming. His muscles, once hardened from years of labor, seemed to throb with an unfamiliar energy. The mist around him grew denser, swirling and wrapping around his body, filling his lungs with the cold, damp air. It was as if the forest itself was calling to him, urging him to make the sacrifice, to shed the very identity that had defined him for so long. A flash of lightning split the sky, blinding in its intensity, and in that moment, Paul felt a deep, shuddering pull within himself. He could feel the roots of the trees beneath him, the soil, the very bones of the earth shifting in response. His mind was flooded with images of the world he had loved, of the forests, of the creatures he had protected, of the rivers and the winds that had always been his companions. But now it felt different. The world seemed to be asking him to become something more, something beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. Paul Bunyan, the creature said again, its voice soft and distant now, as though it was speaking from a great distance. To restore balance, you must shed your mortal form. You will not be a man, but part of the living world, part of the breath of the earth itself. In return, you will become a guardian once more, not as you were, but as you are meant to be. The storm will end, but you will not walk the earth in the same way. Paul closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. The choice was clear now. To save the world, he would have to leave it behind. He would become one with the forest, the sky, the rivers. He would lose himself in the very essence of the earth, and in doing so, restore the balance that had been broken. The wind howled once more, but this time it felt different. It was no longer the violent roar of a storm. It was a whisper, a call to the soul, a beckoning. Without another word, Paul knelt down, his great hands pressing against the wet earth, feeling the pulse of the world beneath him. His muscles tensed, and his breath came in sharp gasps as he prepared for the unimaginable. The very air around him seemed to shimmer with energy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the final move. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he felt something strange, something pulling at him, stretching him, unraveling the very fibers of his being. It was a sensation unlike any he had ever known, a deep, primal change that shook him to his core. And then, as the storm reached its crescendo, Paul Bunyan made the sacrifice. He surrendered himself to the earth, to the storm, to the very forces of nature that had shaped him. His body shimmered and faded, slowly dissolving into the mist, his massive form shrinking, his once mighty strength fading into the soil. The storm roared once more, a deafening, overwhelming sound. And then, as if in response to Paul's sacrifice, it began to fade. The clouds that had darkened the sky began to disperse, the winds died down, and the mist lifted, leaving the world bathed in a soft, golden light. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the forest was silent. The trees stood tall and strong, the rivers flowed with a renewed vigor, and the creatures of the woods stirred from their hiding places, sensing that something had changed. And though Paul Bunyan was no longer there, in the form that the world had known, his spirit remained. He was part of the world now, part of the breath of the earth, the rhythm of the wind, the pulse of the river. He was the guardian once more, not as a man, but as something greater, something eternal. The balance had been restored. The storm had ended. The world had been saved. But Paul Bunyan, the giant of the forest, had become something more, something timeless. As the storm finally began to recede, the world around the forest grew still. The heavy winds that had once howled through the trees now barely stirred the leaves, and the air, thick with the tension of the storm, began to clear, replaced by a cool calm that felt like a gentle breath after a long, violent struggle. The trees, battered but resolute, stood tall in the aftermath, their leaves glistening with droplets of rain. The rivers, once churning with the fury of the storm, had begun to settle, their waters flowing peacefully once again, as though nothing had ever disturbed their course. But there was something different now. The very essence of the forest seemed to hum with a quiet, invisible power, a power that felt ancient, alive, and connected to everything. It was a subtle presence, but undeniable. It was as if the storm had not only passed, but had revealed something deeper, something that had always been there beneath the surface. The animals, too, seemed to sense the change. The deer stepped cautiously from their hidden places in the underbrush, their eyes wide and alert, yet calm. The birds that had taken refuge in the safety of the trees began to sing again, their melodies soft and sweet, as though the world itself had been reborn. In the heart of the forest, where the storm had raged most fiercely, there was now a silence that felt sacred, as though the land itself was resting after a great struggle. The mist, which had cloaked the ground in mystery, the animals, who had always lived under the gentle guidance of the great guardian, continue their paths through the trees and streams. The mighty elk that once roamed the woods now walked with an eerie calmness, their steps measured and sure. The owls, perched high in their trees, hooted softly in the night, as though sharing secrets with the very winds. The foxes, with their golden fur, moved through the underbrush with a grace that was almost otherworldly, their eyes reflecting the wisdom of an ancient protector. The forest had not only been restored, it had been transformed. The trees stood with more strength, their branches heavier with fruit, their trunks taller and thicker. The rivers, too, had found a new clarity, their waters clearer than ever before, shimmering beneath the light of the sun. And on the rare days when a storm cloud gathered on the horizon, the forest stood firm and unshaken. The wind would blow and the rains would fall, but always the storm would pass as quickly as it had come, leaving the world in a peace that only nature could provide. But there was still some quiet pull that the people could not explain. The village had become a little more isolated from the forest, their lives more entwined with their own struggles, and yet there was a sense that something unseen still watched over them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle above the village, a young boy named Sam sat on the edge of the forest, gazing into its depths. His grandmother, the village's oldest elder, had often told him stories of Paul Bunyan, the great protector of the woods, and how he had once walked the earth as a giant, his heart as vast as the forests he loved. That evening, as Sam sat on the edge of the village, he heard a rustling in the trees, a sound unlike any wind, a sound that seemed almost like a whisper. He frowned, leaning forward to listen more closely. The mist began to rise from the ground, curling around the trunks of the trees, enveloping the forest in its cool embrace. "Grandma," he whispered, almost as if seeking reassurance. She had always warned him to stay away from the forest after dark, to not go too close when the mist rose. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was a feeling in the air, a pull, a strange sense of familiarity. Sam stood up slowly, his legs trembling just a little, and took a cautious step toward the trees. He had heard the stories his whole life, but in that moment, he could feel something, a presence. It was not frightening, but comforting in a way he could not explain. As he ventured deeper into the mist, he felt the air around him shift. It was as if the very fabric of the forest welcomed him, wrapping him in its cool embrace, guiding him forward. The rustling sound grew louder, but it was not the wind. It was something else, something alive. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward. And then, through the mist, he saw it, a figure. Tall, shadowed, and yet unmistakably there, standing among the trees. The figure was neither man nor beast, but something in between. Its shape seemed to shimmer and shift with the mist, its presence both awe-inspiring and calm. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether he should retreat or continue. But something told him to stay, that this was not an enemy, but something far older, far wiser than he could understand. The figure's eyes, though they were not fully visible, held a depth of knowledge, as if they could see into his very soul. "Do not be afraid," a voice echoed in his mind, though the figure's lips did not move. It was a voice that resonated with the very earth, with the trees and the winds, with the very heartbeat of the forest. "Who are you?" Sam found his voice at last, though it trembled with uncertainty. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer in the mist. Its features were indistinct, like the branches of the trees that surrounded him, but its presence was undeniable. "I am a part of the forest," it said, its voice as ancient as the land itself. "I am the spirit of the earth, the guardian of the balance. And I have always been with you." Sam's breath caught in his throat. "Paul Bunyan," he whispered, though he could hardly believe the words he was saying. The figure nodded slowly, its presence shifting, almost blending with the trees around it. "I was once a giant," it said softly, "but now I am part of the forest as the forest is part of me. My sacrifice allowed the world to heal, to restore the balance. And now it is your turn to protect it, to remember the story, to honor the sacrifice, and to live in harmony with the land." The mist around them swirled gently, like a soft caress, as if the very earth was acknowledging the exchange. Sam felt something stirring deep within him, a deep sense of duty, of understanding. He had always heard the stories, but now, in this moment, he understood them in a way he never had before. The figure smiled, its eyes soft with ancient wisdom. "Remember, young one," it whispered, "the balance is fragile, but it is not impossible to restore. And though I am no longer the giant you once knew, I am still with you. Always." And then, as if the forest itself were breathing, the figure faded back into the mist, leaving behind only the soft rustle of the trees and the peaceful silence of the woods. Sam stood alone, feeling the weight of the encounter settle on his shoulders. The forest was alive with a secret, one that he would now carry with him, forever intertwined with the legacy of Paul Bunyan and the ancient bond between man and nature. And as he turned to walk back to the village, the wind whispered through the trees, as if in agreement. The balance had been restored, and it would be kept. Always. Sam returned to the village that night, his heart heavy with the weight of the encounter, but also filled with a newfound sense of understanding. As he walked through the misty air, his mind replayed every detail of what had just happened. The figure, the voice, the words spoken. He could still feel the presence of the forest around him, alive and watching, as if the trees themselves had shared in that moment. When he reached his home, the lights inside were dim, and his grandmother sat by the fire, knitting a small shawl. She looked up as he entered, her old eyes narrowing in concern. "You've been gone for a long time, Sam," she said softly, her voice a mix of worry and knowing. I saw something," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something in the forest?" His grandmother didn't flinch. She had always known the forest was more than it seemed, that there were things within it beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. She set down her knitting and looked at him intently, her expression serious but calm. "Tell me," she said. And so, Sam told her everything. The figure, the mist, the voice, and the powerful feeling of connection that had surged within him. When he finished, he expected her to scold him, to tell him he had imagined it all. Instead, she only nodded, as though the story was one she had been waiting to hear for years. "You saw the spirit," she said quietly. "The spirit of Paul Bunyan." Sam looked at her in confusion. "But you always said he was a legend, a myth." His grandmother smiled gently, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Not just a legend, my boy. Paul Bunyan was a guardian, a protector of the forest. But he had to give everything to restore the balance. Now, his spirit lives on in the land, in the trees, the rivers, the animals, everywhere. He is no longer the giant you've heard of in stories. He is part of this world, part of the earth itself." Sam sat down beside her, his mind racing. The enormity of what he had experienced was starting to sink in. He had seen the essence of the forest, the very soul of the land. Paul Bunyan's sacrifice had made him something more than a man, more than a legend. He had become the heartbeat of the forest itself. "And now it's your turn," his grandmother said softly, her voice firm with wisdom. "To protect the balance, to live in harmony with the land, just as he did." Sam felt the weight of her words settle on his chest. He had always known there was something special about the forest, something he couldn't quite explain. Now he understood. He was a part of it as much as it was a part of him. The rest of the night passed in a quiet, thoughtful silence. Sam slept little, his mind churning with what lay ahead. In his dreams, he wandered through the forest, seeing the trees, the rivers, and the creatures that lived within it, all interconnected in ways he had never imagined. When he awoke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft golden light across the village. The air was cool, the mist still lingering in the forest, but there was a sense of calm, a sense of peace. Sam knew that whatever the future held, he was ready. He would carry on the legacy of Paul Bunyan, the guardian of the forest, in a way that was uniquely his own. And as he stepped outside, he felt the pull of the forest once more, gentle yet insistent. It was calling to him, not as a giant, but as a protector, a guardian of the balance. The storm had passed, the world had been healed, and now it was his turn to ensure that the harmony remained. Sam took a deep breath and headed toward the forest, the mist swirling around his feet. He knew that, just as the forest had been changed by Paul Bunyan's sacrifice, so too would he be changed by the journey ahead. But he was no longer afraid, for he was not alone. The forest was with him, always. Years went by, and Sam grew into the role that the forest had silently entrusted to him. The village, though still distant from the woods, came to rely on him in ways they could not explain. When the crops flourished or the rains came at just the right time, they whispered that the forest had blessed them. But Sam knew the truth. The forest had been in balance for so long because of the silent work he did every day, tending to the land, ensuring that its ancient rhythms were never broken. He walked the forest each morning, listening to the whispers of the trees, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet. The creatures that had once been skittish around him now trusted him, moving alongside him like old friends. He had become part of the forest as Paul Bunyan had before him. And though he never saw the giant spirit again, he could feel it, Paul Bunyan's presence, in every rustle of the leaves, in every turn of the river, in every gust of wind that swept through the branches. On quiet nights, when the moon was full and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, Sam would sit by the river, just as he had once done, and feel the peace of the forest all around him. It was then that he knew that Paul Bunyan was always there, not just as a legend, but as part of the very soul of the land. One evening, as Sam sat by the river, the mist rose once again, curling around the trees like a living thing. He smiled, feeling the familiar pull, as if the forest was calling him to the very heart of it, where the power of the earth was strongest. He stood and walked into the mist, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. And in the heart of the forest, where the trees stood tall and the rivers wound through the land like veins of life, Sam stopped and closed his eyes. He was not alone. He could feel Paul Bunyan's spirit, the same warmth that had embraced him so many years ago, surrounding him. He whispered, just as he had before, "The balance is yours now." The wind picked up, swirling around Sam, and the trees seemed to nod in agreement. The forest was whole again, its guardian, not a giant with a hammer, but a quiet protector who had given everything to maintain the peace. And in that moment, Sam understood. The legacy of Paul Bunyan was not about strength, but about harmony, the quiet balance between man and nature. The earth had healed, and its guardian had become one with it. As the mist cleared, Sam stood tall, no longer the boy who had wandered into the forest, but the protector of its balance, the living link between past and future. The forest was safe, and its story would live on, forever intertwined with his own. The storm had passed. The forest had been healed. And Sam, like Paul Bunyan before him, had found his place in the eternal dance between man and nature.